Mr Speaker.
Stuart Nash.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. Before I talk about this bill, I'd just like to comment on a couple of the comments that previous speakers have made. Nothing about Mr Scott, he really didn't say anything, except he actually, I thought for a minute there he was saying it should remain in government ownership. He said, let's consider it still does, and I lost him there. Mr Seymour is an interesting political character. He hawks a Standard Act line that the private sector is always better than the public, an ideological burp from last century, and amazing that Act actually stands for the Association of Consumers and Taxpayers. And I'm just wondering when Mr Seymour is actually going to stand up for consumers and taxpayers. Unbelievable. Anyway, his political relevance is represented in the polls, where he's about 1% at the moment. Mr Bailey, now Mr Bailey was an interesting speech. Like all Nats, he's more concerned about finance than families, and that is a shame. It's a shame that the most passionate I have ever heard Mr Bailey is when it comes to banking. Not about homes, not about houses, not about jobs, not about economic development, but about banking. Governance structures. Governance structures in banking. That is Mr Bailey's passion. Unbelievable. That man really is out of touch with the issues that affect Middle New Zealand. And I just wish Mr Bailey would sort of channel that passion that none of us knew he had, actually, until he stood up there and shouted the house down. But I wish he would channel that passion into something worthwhile. I doubt it, but it would be good to see. And then Mr Bishop stood up here and said, this is an embarrassing bill. Now, I actually thought Mr Bishop was a little bit more in touch with New Zealanders in this, but this just showed again how out of touch Mr Bishop is. Now, I remember a referendum. It occurred, I don't know, 3 or 4 years ago. It was a citizens-initiated referendum, and it was about the sale of state assets. 67.3 New Zealanders, over 1 million New Zealanders, voted no to selling state assets. And Mr Bishop stands up here and says we should sell Kiwibank. There is a man that is out of touch with Middle New Zealand. There is a man that is out of touch with 67.3% of Kiwis that do not want our assets sold. But Mr Bishop, let me enlighten you a little bit as to the impact that Kiwibank has had on the market. In, I think it was 2008-2009, there was a banking inquiry set up. The CEO of Kiwibank addressed this inquiry, and he said he believed that the impact of Kiwibank on the New Zealand banking sector saved New Zealanders in its first 5 years about $1 billion in interest. About $1 billion in interest due to increased competition. And fees, yes, and fees. Kiwibank has played an incredibly important role in the New Zealand financial sector. But let's say that this Kiwibank has that this $1 billion that Kiwibank has saved New Zealand consumers and taxpayers, let's say it has a multiplier effect of about $10 billion. That's $10 billion into the New Zealand economy in terms of growth, in terms of jobs, in terms of retail spending, in terms of home ownership that would not have occurred if Kiwibank hadn't existed. Kiwibank, Mr Speaker, was the right thing to do at the time. Kiwibank, Mr Speaker, is still the right thing to do. And why would we give this up? Why would we give this up? Mr Speaker, the way the world works at the moment in large corporate organisations, or large, actually, financial sectors dominated by these large corporates, is if a competitor comes in and they get a little bit too smart, a little bit too successful, a little bit too aggressive, what happens is they're bought. They're just bought by one of the behemoths that dominate the industry. We've seen it time and time again, and it's why all New Zealand banks except Kiwibank are owned by Australians or eventually offshore organisations. All big ones, much big ones, because they have been bought because they've got in the way of profits. We have a bank in New Zealand that is owned by New Zealanders. We only have one bank in New Zealand that is predominantly owned by New Zealanders, and it is called Kiwibank. Why would we sell this? Have we not learnt from the debacle of BNZ? Have we not learnt from the mistakes of Mr Seymour's predecessors? It seems not. But thank goodness Mr Parker is standing up for those 1 million Kiwis who do not want to sell our assets. Thank goodness Mr Parker is standing up for that $1 billion that we have saved New Zealanders in interest and fees. Mr Speaker, that is the reason why I back this bill. That is the reason why I believe Kiwibank absolutely needs to remain in New Zealand ownership. And that, Mr Speaker, is why I hope that Kiwibank will be part of the New Zealand financial sector for generations to come, because Kiwibank works for Kiwis, and I think that is incredibly important. Thank you very much.
Jamie Lee Ross.